Hey you guys, here's a nice little game featuring the Wing Gambit against the French. So this is what I've been playing recently. My opponent's rated just over 1300. We start with e4, e6, and now the Wing Gambit goes knight to f3, and then when d5 is played, which is always played in the French, if they're actually playing the French, then here you just advance the pawn to e5. Now c5 will nearly always follow, and then b4. And at this point, your French player goes, what the heck is this? What is going on? So if they take, that's normally quite all right for white, but bottom line is what we're doing is we're just knocking them straight off their perch. Now in this game, my opponent played c4, so I just pushed c3, just blocking up the pawns here. And the general idea, I mean, the weird thing is that French players don't often like to push the c-pawn too far forward. They really want you to capture it, but they certainly don't want you to capture it with the b-pawn. It does allow them to develop their bishop though. So now we have bishop to d7, and I push d3, a5, a3. Now here, I think I was slightly inaccurate, because after pawn takes, we now have bishop takes, because this pawn is pinned, right? If I capture the bishop, I lose my rook. And maybe that's not the end of the world. But here I just block with my dark squared bishop, and we have a trade of bishops. I recapture with the knight, because it comes with development. Plus it also means that there's a discovered defense by the queen on the rook. Okay, so I'm just getting ready to develop my bishop, castle my king, and start an assault on my opponent. So she, I'm assuming she's a she, captures on d3, I recapture with the bishop, and now I'm ready to castle. I do actually have a lead in development, which is the general idea with a gambit, although I'm just a pawn behind. But more importantly, my opponent is well out of their comfort zone in the French. So bishop out to a4 is protected by the rook attacking my queen. I just slide my queen across to b7 with a threat of my own of capturing the b2 pawn. Now the queen comes to, sorry, b7 pawn. Queen comes out to c7 to defend the pawn, and I simply go ahead and castle. Now black's got a decent position here, good pawns. Right, I've got this guy's a bit out on his own. He's defended once by the knight, but black is slightly hampered by having fewer pieces on the board, right? So at this point I have been thinking about ideas of putting my bishop here with a fork. That would pretty much force the bishop to capture, then queen captures. But now that the queen's protecting this pawn, the knight can just block. So the knight comes out, and now I decide to grab the h7 pawn. It is defended by the rook, but my bishop is defended by my queen. So rook can't capture. Now one option here is for black to play g7, at which point I decided that I would take with the bishop, pawn takes, queen takes, and I've got 3 pawns for my queen, for my bishop, right? But more importantly, this king is out there in the cold, whereas my king is nice and snuggled up. This is the ideal setup that you want. All 3 pawns still at home, rook plugging the hole, knight defending this pawn, knight defended by this pawn. I've even got a spare knight, so I would be quite happy there. Now black here I think correctly decides not to try and trap the bishop, but in turn grabs a free pawn. So I now take the knight on g8. So if black recaptures, then castling is just out of the question, right? So we have a trade of knights. I recapture with this one. Now I do have to be very aware that the queen is looking at h2, defended by the rook. Okay, now this was the case wherever this knight moves, there's that threat, but that is the value of keeping your h-pawn there, for one thing, and also having your knight on f3. Now I guess if the h-pawn had moved, then it's still not an option because the queen wouldn't be defended by the rook, but even so, this really still is the ideal defensive setup there. Okay, so we trade, and now the rook captures the bishop, so the rook's no longer looking down this semi-open file at h2. So let's just reassess. My opponent is still 1 pawn up, but on the downside, the big imbalance in against black is this isolated king in the middle of the board. So what I need to do is I need to try and capitalize on that. And we've only played 16 moves. So what do you do when your opponent's king is in the middle of the board? You need to mobilize your pieces, and you need to go after the king and cause him trouble. So queen h7, I'm now threatening the rook, and there is only one move. Well, I thought there was only one move. Actually, I expected the rook to go to f8, in which case I could grab this pawn, but my opponent found a better move, king to e7. So now the rooks are connected because the king's moved. Castling is not such an issue. This king actually wants to be, in this reed bed of pawns here. So I drop my queen back to h4 with check. I'm not really attacking the bishop because it's defended. And f6 is pushed. And now, simple, quiet move, rook to e1. A couple of things good about this move. One is it lines up the rook against the king. The other one is gets my rook off the light-coloured squares. Black has a light-coloured bishop, right? So anything that I can do to leave my pieces on dark squares makes this bishop less potent in the game. All right, so rook comes across attacking the queen. I'm not impressed. Queen to g4. So now I'm looking at this undefended pawn on g7. And now for some reason my opponent plays f5. I guess they must simply have missed that this pawn was hanging, right? And that's why they're 1300, So check here, and now I've got a couple of options. I knew I could play my queen to here if I wanted to. It's defended twice. Alternatively, I can simply snatch off the queen. Now this is a really important position that you kind of need to evaluate. Material is technically equal. Numerically, we're equal, right? However, big differences are, I have a knight, my opponent has a bishop. Now, bishops, when the board is open like this, can be stronger than knights. But you have to start anticipating the end game. What's going to happen here? So, for example, we've got pawns on both sides of the board, right? I've got pawns on both sides of the board. That's in the bishop's favour, because the bishop can traverse the whole board very quickly, whereas a knight is a slow piece. Other considerations are, well, I mean, king safety is the other main one. My king has these 3 pawns, so my king can shepherd these pawns, right? Now, if we can break up these pawns, then even having a bishop, which is a high-speed piece, long-range piece, if we can break up the pawns, then I want to make it difficult for my opponent to be able to defend all of these pawns, which can't defend each other, whereas I've got a trio here that can defend each other. Okay, so I decide to grab off the queen and then grab this pawn that was in the middle. So now we've got 3 isolated pawns for black. King comes across, and I decide here to protect my rook by centralizing my knight. Generally a good idea to have your knight in the middle of the board, particularly in the end game. It likes to be there. I've also got options of bringing my rook across and pairing up my rooks. So now bishop comes down. Now I can't capture the bishop here because my knight is busy defending that rook. So king would just take the rook. So I bring my rook from a1 to e1. So my rook is now defended by its buddy, and now I can take the bishop. So the bishop has to move. Bishop e4, I push a pawn to kick the bishop. Now, another critical point in the game. Black is counterattacking my knight, whereas I am attacking the bishop here. Now, if I capture the bishop, black takes my knight, I get a free pawn. I get one of these guys, right? And defend the rook if I capture one of these pawns, okay? So that's what I go ahead and do. I capture with my f-pawn, rook takes knight, and I capture black's f-pawn. Black is now down to 2 pawns against my 4, and the issue of the imbalance between the minor pieces has been resolved because we've traded them off. So I've got this weak guy here, and I've got potentially still this trio of pawns there, so it should be a winning position now for white. Rook comes down to attack the pawn. I decide not to try and defend. I give check again, and grab this pawn. Okay, so from here the king cannot go onto any of these squares. It has to retreat to the 5th rank. So I grab that pawn. For some reason now black doubles up the attack against this pawn, which was just sitting there ready anyway. Now we find ourselves in a situation because I've got a fairly advanced pawn, so I want to convert this pawn as soon as possible. Black wants to do the same with their d pawn. So that pawn falls. This is fine. So I've just created myself a escape square for my king, and also defending this pawn with another pawn. All good stuff. Now I push f6, check, which I expected, and king to f2. I was planning for this. I could have played king h2. However, I could then line myself up for the 2 rooks lining themselves up on the same on the 2nd rank and taking out this pawn and causing my king problems. So what I thought was, if the rook comes here, I can always block it with my rook. Black instead plays the rook from d3 to d1, and I push again to f7. Now there is a blunder coming up. Rook to there, this is fine. He's not going to, well, my opponent's not going to capture the pawn there, and this is my blunder. Okay, now the mistake that I made here is assuming what my opponent was going to do. Like when I kind of gave check on the back rank and the king moved, I didn't consider all the possibilities. I thought, well, look, she's not going to capture my rook here because pawn takes, I get a queen, game over, right? What I didn't factor in was rook takes f7. And now we have a face-off between all the rooks. Okay, so we're going to be trading rooks. So here I decide to try and lure the king away from the pawn. So I give check, king has to capture, I capture the rook, right? Don't know if it's saved me any time, because now the king just moves back towards the pawn. And now we've got an issue because I've stupidly lost my f-pawn, which was just about to promote. And so now my pawns are on the 2nd and 3rd ranks, whereas this pawn only has 4 jumps left to go to promote. So we're in a very classic kind of endgame puzzle scenario. So I give check. I want to force the king behind the pawn. That's going to slow down the pawn's progress. Okay, so now, you know, I could have here have just put my rook straight to d8, but then the pawn can just carry on its journey, right? So first, give check. Now the king's got 2 options. King can either go onto the b file, in which case it's kind of cut off from the rest of the board, or it can go to the d file behind the pawn. So he d-files himself. I put my rook behind the pawn, and now we are in a race. Okay, so fairly straightforward, this stuff. Okay, so now this pawn is ready to promote. Okay, first the king comes down here. Obviously, if the pawn promoted on this move, rook takes queen, and it's all done by the shouting. So the king has to go to e2. I push my pawn, queen. All right, now we have a situation. I have to take the queen, there's no question. King has to take the rook, right? Otherwise it's losing. Okay, so now we've got a situation where the king is quite a long way away, and I have, remember, you know, I said that it was an advantage having my king's bodyguard pawns all together so that my king could guide them and shepherd them up the board, right? Let's see how it pans out. So I push g5, king advances. I push g6, king advances. I push h7. Rook now comes down and gives check. This is fine. So I go to king h6, king advances again. Now this is what they're preparing, right? Rook here, now defended by the king, can capture this pawn. Okay, and I figure this out. So I calculated it. We're down to less than 3 minutes each, right? I know I can do this because now rook to h5 check, king moves, rook takes queen, king takes rook, and there is no way that this king can stop this pawn now from promoting. Okay, so now the situation is the queen is guarding this whole g file. So the king can't go here, there's only one move. There, king pushes. There, king pushes. There, king pushes. There, king pushes. There. Now if I do the same again, stalemate, isn't it? Because the king would have no safe squares to move to, so we can't do that. So now we find ourselves in a situation with a classic king and queen ending. Come down to this rank, so I need to quarantine the king in the smallest area of the board that I can. King comes here, take opposition, right? Kings are 2 squares apart in line with each other. King here, queen now. Okay, so now the king can't go on any of these squares. It is forced onto the side of the board. Queen to g2 now keeps the king constrained onto the first rank. And now my king just pushes across, right? Now at any point, if the king goes back towards my king, then the queen is just going to checkmate. So here, and then there's only one legal move, and then checkmate on there. So very, very interesting game. Thank you, Pancho Abigail, for a really interesting game. Still don't know how I feel about this Wing Gambit against the French, but I was looking for some interesting kind of approach. It's certainly on the spicy side, so it might be something you want to try. If you find yourself, if you're an e4 player as white and you come up against the French a lot, which I do now at the moment, there's reasons why it's popular. It is pretty sound opening, and it also means that, you know, with this first move, it's called the French defense now, right? And black has now kind of taken claim of the opening. Now we are in the French territory, and whatever white does now, black is going to know the response. We're now in black's book rather than white's book, and that's the thing I like mainly about the French. And it can go lots of different ways. It can be slow, it can be positional, it can be sharp or whatever. But this approach, for sure, is a great way to wrong foot a French player. And in this instance, it worked out pretty well. I don't think I had a huge advantage throughout the game, and clearly I did make a blunder towards the end, but I did have that couple of pawn advantage that I should have capitalised on a bit better. So a couple of learning points for me definitely in that game. Not least, don't assume that your opponent is going to make the first move that comes to your mind. You should respect them and know that they are going to have a good think, and they are going to find the best move that they can in each position as well. So, you know, that's the mistake that I made on a couple of occasions in that game, and clearly something I need to work on. So I hope you've taken some tips from this. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.